In what may be considered a blasphemous statement, especially since my whole channel is dedicated to horror, I have never enjoyed classic Resident Evil. In fact, I hated it. I can't put my finger on what exactly I didn't like about the classic games because there were a myriad of reasons that, when combined, made for a Sunderland hates this with every fibre of his being. So for many years, I just didn't want to play any of them. But I knew I had to at least try them at some point. So last year, I did what's something that most gamers absolutely despise. I played some classic Resident Evil games with a guide. And you know what? I still didn't enjoy it. But I think this time it was my fault. Playing with a guide took away a lot of what makes Resident Evil, while also diminishing the tense and somewhat unforgiving experience that many people have come to love. So like many times before, I just put the series at the back of my mind and became comfortable with my belief that these games weren't for me. That was until I started this channel. I've been doing this for a few months now, and I've always wanted to do something special for Halloween. But since my channel is dedicated to horror, I couldn't simply just review another game or make another video. I had to do something that was different or put me out of my comfort zone. And that is when I had this idea. Why not review Resident Evil? But this time, just play it completely blind and experience it in its purest form. It had been a long time since I played a classic Resident Evil game, so I was going in fresh, and I thought it could be a good idea. So here we are. After many years of hating one of the most beloved horror games of all time, I have completed both campaigns in Resident Evil, and I have some thoughts, some sexy thoughts, on Halloween. The story of Resident Evil is beautiful in its simplicity. I'd easily swipe right if it was wearing a furry mask and a diaper. A series of bizarre murders have gone down on the outskirts of Raccoon City, and the super buff and thick members of the Raccoon City Police Department's STARS team have been sent to investigate. Bravo team is the first to be sent in, and well, that doesn't go well. So Alpha Team is sent in to locate their mates, but that doesn't go well either, and they are attacked by monster dog boys. The helicopter they arrived on decides to leave them stranded because helicopters are dicks and are apparently the gender of every alt-right edgelord on the internet, so the crew take refuge in the nearby Spencer mansion, which in no way looks ominous at all or full of nightmares. Once the crew gets in, consisting of Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Big Daddy Barry Burton, and cool guy with slicked back hair and glasses Albert Wesker, they soon find out the mansion has been inhabited by zombies who don't pay rent or clean up after themselves, which is pretty inconsiderate. Other baddie monster boys have also made the mansion their home. The Scooby Gang has to try and survive the horrors in the mansion, try to escape, and uncover why there are loads of zombies and monsters wandering around and killing things. When describing the overall story of Resident Evil, I can't help but compare it to a B-movie. That is for many reasons, but the setup and the acting, which I will get into later, feel like it's ripped out of some so bad it's good horror movie from the 70s or the 80s. It doesn't break any new ground of the zombie formula, and that is because it didn't need to. It was the first entry in the series and came out at a time when zombies weren't as oversaturated as they are today, and it didn't have any of that sequel baggage you don't want customs to search. It was able to do its own thing because it was trying something people hadn't experienced in the dark decade of the 90s. All of the characters are very one-dimensional, and the super bad corporation doing super bad things is dated by today's standards, but it works for what it's trying to do. The plot is not at the forefront of the game anyway, and is mainly used to motivate the player to get them to go where they need to go. There are some slight twists and backstabs to keep the plot somewhat interesting, but it clearly wasn't the main focus. One issue I had with the story is the cutscenes. Not their content, because that is some pure B-grade goodness, but their pacing. After every sentence a character says in these cutscenes, there is a long pause. Like the game is trying to piece together the dialogue in real time. It makes every cutscene drag on, and some of them can get pretty long, which exacerbates the problem.
What is it?
Blood. Jill, see if you can find any other clues. I'll be examining this. Hope this is not Chris's blood.
It is like every character in this game has respiratory problems and needs to take long and deep breaths between every sentence they say. This perfectly segues into my next issue of the cutscenes. You can't skip them. Considering how there is a real risk of replaying large portions of this game over and over again, some of which may have several cutscenes where potato people talk about giant snakes and
Jill sandwich.
Means you have to sit through these slow cutscenes over and over again. I just wish there was an option to skip them. Maybe if the player had already seen them, they could just move the pace along. Capcom knew people would replay this game and try to beat it as fast as possible because they actively encouraged this through unlockables and timing the player at the end. So I don't understand why they thought these cutscenes were that good the player would have to watch them in their entirety every single time they played. Of course, this could be explained by hardware limitations, but they still bugged me. Now I can't talk about the cutscenes without mentioning the voice acting. It is a fucking meme at this point. Every single person who reviews this game mentions it and makes the haha funnies about how bad it is. And it's true, it's terrible. But I won't be playing a montage of bad clips or anything like that because it's been done to death. You know it's bad, I know it's bad, but I kinda love it. Mainly because I think it lends to the B-movie vibe this game has. It is basically saying the plot is kinda dumb and you shouldn't take it seriously, which is something I always loved about Resident Evil. It really adds to the charm of the game, and without it, I don't think I would have enjoyed it as much. It was nice to giggle after an onslaught of tension. Would the game be better if the voice acting wasn't complete arse? Probably, but it would also lose some of its charm, which I think has become one of the most beloved aspects of Resident Evil. Even though the core story is kind of okay and somewhat held back by pacing issues and bad voice acting, I think the notes the player finds throughout the game are where the story truly shines. Most of the notes are written by Umbrella employees stationed at the mansion. You know, the employees whose heads you've been turning into strawberry jam this entire time. You learn more about Umbrella and their motivations, which is pretty cool, but I think the best notes are when they focus on the struggles of those who were present during the outbreak. The most famous note is the Keeper's Diary. It was written by an Umbrella researcher who was responsible for exterminating animals who had been tested on. Unfortunately for the employee, during the outbreak, he was infected by the T-virus. You get to read about who this person was before they were infected, what their job involved, and their daily routine. And once they become infected, you learn about how the T-virus altered their body and mind, and how they are trying to cope with that. They also describe about how they killed one of their colleagues, but that's what you get for reheating Indian food in the office microwave, you fuck. After reading several entries, the diary ends with the researcher describing how hungry and itchy they are. The final 2 words they wrote before succumbing to the infection were itchy, tasty. After you read the diary, a zombie comes out of a closet and attacks you. That zombie is the man who wrote the diary. Why I love this is throughout the entire game, you have seen so many zombies and you've killed so many of them, but you know nothing about them. But you now know the story of this one zombie, and it makes for a very memorable and pretty emotional encounter. Notes such as this are fantastic as they dispose of the camp and B-movie story of the main game and offer a more darker and human perspective. The diary humanized these monsters. They had lives, family, people they loved, and all these things they have now forgotten. All they want to do now is eat. It is a great use of storytelling. It can be a bit jarring to watch a cutscene with terrible voice acting and awkward dialogue, then read a tragic story about a man losing his mind, but I think the game benefits from the inclusion of notes because it adds to the horror. Overall, I admittedly had a fun time watching Resident Evil's story unfold. You're not going to find anything groundbreaking or particularly engaging here, but I found myself having a pretty fun time when looking at it like a silly horror movie that is a bit self-aware. I would love to see a Netflix series that followed a similar style because it was able to find a balance between camp and horror. When I think of Resident Evil story, camp and horror are immediately what comes to mind, and I hope the other games continue that trend. But let's get on to the meat and potatoes. What is there to say about Resident Evil's gameplay that hasn't already been extensively said? Not a lot, but you haven't heard it from me, Mr. I don't like Resident Evil, so here I go. The gameplay of Resident Evil is quintessential survival horror. All the hallmarks you would expect are here and in their purest form. You probably know each of the aspects of survival horror that I'm going to talk about, but instead of not wasting your time with hearing something you've already heard numerous times, I'm going to waste your time by talking about things you already know about. Throughout your time of Resident Evil, you must tangle with several different mechanics that define survival horror. That being item management, limited inventory, clunky controls, limited resources, locked doors, and terrible combat. All these things work in tandem to create the genre we know and love. First, I'm going with the first thing I encountered, and that is the tank controls, and oh boy, do you feel like each player character has treads instead of legs. Each movement is extremely deliberate and you feel like you really have to commit to every step you take. Walking and running in a straight line isn't hard, but turning left or right feels very cumbersome. Obviously, this is the definition of the tank control thing, but as soon as there are enemies in the picture, the reasoning behind their inclusion becomes very evident. Dodging enemies is very difficult when you haven't become accustomed to controls, and I found myself taking damage because Chris and Jill didn't know how to fucking run properly. The controls become more of a pain when enemies are placed in areas of tight turns. This this meant I had to fight the controls, dodge enemies while also trying to throw myself around corners with the hopes and dreams of not getting hit. Even though I am complaining about the controls, playing Resident Evil reminded me how much they add to the tension of the game. If I could dart around the enemies like Roadrunner on cocaine, the game may not have been as tense, but because each enemy is a significant obstacle and I don't have full control of the player character, it made even the 10th run-in with a zombie a stressful affair, especially in new areas. Sometimes obstacles will be in the way alongside with monsters, and this puts your skills with the controls to the test. Also, the tank controls are something I did get used to. The game allows you to explore the mansion at the start without any enemies, so you become somewhat accustomed to how the game controls, and after an hour of playing, tank controls become second nature. I can imagine the controls may put off some people, but if you're in that camp, you should still give Resident Evil a try, or any other game with tank controls. Don't worry, tank controls don't bite. The zombies do though. Fuck, I hate myself for making that joke. The second thing I noticed when I started playing was the use of fixed camera angles. The survival horror enthusiast's wet dream. These things are so ingrained in the genre, but only few horror games use them these days, and those are mainly independent titles or titles banking on nostalgia. But are they effective? Well, when used right, I believe so, and luckily, they are executed extremely well in Resident Evil. They show the player the environment without them losing their sense of momentum or direction. They highlight items of interest or puzzles, but my favourite aspect of fixed camera angles is how they hide enemies. Since the cameras are static, the developers really had to get creative with the enemy placement so they could surprise and scare the player, and I think they did a great job of that. Numerous times I walked into a new area only to get surprised by an enemy. Even exploring old areas, which I'd ran through numerous times, always kept me on the edge of my seat, because even though I knew where the enemies were, not being able to see them until I was running towards them creeped me out. And those feelings just prove how well their use hold up 20 plus years later. My only problem with them is transitioning from one screen to the next is a little slow. It usually takes about a second to load, and though this doesn't sound like a long time, it does add up. This also breaks the flow of movement and slows the game down. It can be annoying when I had to backtrack to grab an item, and that process was slowed down because of the angle transitions. Not a massive issue, but one I felt like I needed to address. I don't think every survival horror game needs fixed camera angles, and when they are used badly, they can really ruin a game. But when they are used correctly, they add another layer of tension to a game that some more recent titles can't even think about matching. And I think Resident Evil falls in that "yeah brah, it works" the best category. The player will use their tank controls to explore the Spencer Mansion and its surrounding areas, alongside a super sketchy underground facility that is in no way responsible for the zombies, giant spiders, and garden variety plants that want to kill you. Throughout this little fun excursion, the player will realize they haven't got very large pockets, meaning they have a small inventory space. Each item in the game, whether it is a key, a weapon and its ammo, puzzle pieces, or 420 smoke until you choke healing items, all take up a space in your inventory. Once your pockets are chocker full of goodies, you will not be able to carry anything else. Before I played this game for this review, I always found this to be an annoying aspect of the game. I didn't like how it restricted what items I could pick up, but now I see how genius this design decision was. You see, little Mr. or Miss YouTube viewer, a limited inventory significantly adds to the survival aspect of Resident Evil. You can't just go in, packed in the nines of ammo and healing items, because you will soon find that you have no room for other essential items you will need in order to progress. Instead, you need to think about what you are going to take, and more importantly, what are you going to leave behind? Do you need to take extra healing items, or do you think you can progress without taking much damage? What guns are you going to take? And do you think you will need heaps of ammo? Or are you going to try your best to avoid combat? What essential items do you also need to take? These are just some of the questions I was asking myself before I left the comfort zone of the safe room to explore each area. Luckily, each safe room has an item box which the player can use to store resources or items they don't need right now. And in a great design decision, no matter which item box you use throughout the game, the items you stored will appear in them, and you can also store a lot of stuff too. This was a great way at balancing the limited inventory, because it meant you didn't have to waste items in order to pick new ones up. You could just store what you didn't need and get the stuff you did need. You still had to think about your inventory, but you at least had some flexibility. And another reason why I was constantly questioning every move I made was because resources in Resident Evil are finite and spread thin. I rarely found loads of ammunition or healing items during both my playthroughs. It always felt the developers gave me just enough to get through the game if I didn't make too many mistakes or wasn't stupid. This decision on behalf of the developers to limit the amount of resources greatly changed how I played the game. In most horror titles, I was cautious but not overly so. I knew I would be able to take some hits or waste some bullets because I always had heaps of them, or I knew there would always be more. I relied on that knowledge. But with Resident Evil, I had to change that mindset completely. Caution was the name of the game. Well, the name of the game is Resident Evil, but you get where I'm going. I would approach each area slowly, analysing the environment and the position of the enemies and trying to figure out the best means of approach, which would result in myself not using any resources. But this also put a lot of weight on each mistake I made. Each bullet shot, each time I needed to heal felt important, and I felt wasteful every time I used a resource. In the back of my mind, I always thought about whether I could have played better and not wasted that healing item or that bullet. And if you are not careful and just play the game without considering what resources are available, you can completely screw yourself over and have to restart. Several times throughout both my playthroughs, I found myself with low ammo or low health because of too many mistakes. This caused me to become a little scaredy cat. Each room and enemy was something that could kill me in a heartbeat, and because I never knew what was coming next, I didn't think I was going to survive. The tension in these moments was palpable. When I did finally stumble across the resources I needed, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Moments like these solidified how important the decision was to limit the amount of resources in order to make the player feel like they are surviving something that is truly horrific. You wouldn't have moments like these if you had regenerating health or bucket loads of ammo. I used to hate the idea of limited resources because I didn't want to be severely punished when I made too many mistakes or didn't know the game inside out. But now, after sinking many hours into Resident Evil, I wouldn't have this game be any other way. One of the most interesting and important game mechanics in Resident Evil is how the player saves. I could have added this into the inventory section, but I really wanted to discuss it by itself. You see, this game came out in a time long before the comforting cuddle of checkpoints, but other games allowed the player to save as many times as they wanted. Resident Evil threw in a curveball. Sure, you can save like any other game you played before at these things called typewriters, but you can only save if you have an ink ribbon. Ink ribbons are also limited resources, such as the others I mentioned previously. So saving, which is generally a comforting experience, now becomes a part of your survival. You need to think about when and where to save and how frequently you want to save. If you save too much, you will run out of ink ribbons, and you will have to play large portions of the game knowing that if you die, all that progress you just made is lost. But if you save too little and be too cautious, that means you're playing large chunks of the game without a save file as a safety net. It is a fine balance that I was constantly thinking about. There were a couple times in the game where I took out a big boss or covered a large section of the game, but only saved about 30 minutes ago. Sure, I could waste an ink ribbon to make sure I didn't have to do all that again, but what if I needed that ink ribbon down the line and didn't have it? Or another scenario I would face is I only had a few ink ribbons left and I had no idea when I would find some more. I used to completely despise the save system in Resident Evil, but now I have learned to appreciate it and how it adds to the survival horror. If you find that perfect balance of saving when you need to but not too often, the save system won't be too much of a problem. But the fact that I was always thinking about it and was relieved when I finally did save, even though I wasn't sure whether it was a good idea, proves how integral and engaging this system is. Now we've got all that out of the way, let's talk about something else. Since this is a survival horror game, you know that shit has some puzzles, and in my opinion they are really hit and miss in Resident Evil. Some are really cool and force you to think, like the V-Jolt puzzle where you have to mix chemicals together. You have to use basic mathematics to create the chemical you needed, and it actually made me stop and really think about what I was doing. I was never good at math, so I actually had to write things down in order to figure out what I needed to do. While I was mixing the chemicals together, I would constantly check back at my notes to make sure I was doing it right. Doing that was really cool, and that's something that is completely lost in horror games. But puzzles such as this are few and far between, and the main puzzle you will encounter is put an item in something or block puzzles. I generally enjoyed the former. Numerous times throughout Resident Evil, your progress will be stopped because you need to find an item to put into a hole or a locked door that needs a specific key. The game map doesn't really tell you any of this information regarding what keys or items go where, so you have to keep it in the back of your mind while playing until you figure out what you need to do. It is also a great way of encouraging the player to explore while also requiring them to paint a mental map of the game. I think this really added to the sense of feeling lost and overwhelmed. I always felt downtrodden when I found something I had no idea what to do with, but also felt so rewarded when I stumbled across what the item was used for. Sure, puzzles such as this and calling them puzzles are a bit of a stretch, and they aren't exactly challenging, but they also aren't a nuisance. But Resident Evil also has block puzzles, and they are the absolute worst thing in this game. These block puzzles are annoying because they are slow and feel absolutely pointless because the solution is so obvious and easy that I kept wondering why not just remove them. The best example of a pointless block puzzle is the one in the flooded area underground. You have to push these 3 boxes into this water so you can cross. It is super easy, but holy fuck is it just the worst thing ever. You need to push them down this long ass hallway, and all you have for company is the fucking scratching sound the box makes when it slides against the floor. Yeah, this is some fucking relaxing shit. This isn't fun or interesting. This isn't fun or rewarding. It is just a dumb way of adding an apparent puzzle when in reality, it didn't need to exist. If you take this block puzzle out of the game, nothing of worth is lost, and in fact, it makes the game better because the dumb fucking thing doesn't exist. Luckily, stuffing up a block puzzle can't just straight up kill you, right? Well, you'd be fucking wrong about that, because the very first block puzzle in the game is in a room where you need to push a button to unlock a cabinet to get an essential item to progress. But pushing the button will cause poison gas to come out of 2 vents and kill you. So you need to push these 2 statues over the vents so when you push the button, you don't die. Sounds pretty easy, right? Well, it is, but every time I tried this, I would just miss by a pixel and fucking die by poison. So I would have to run back and slowly push these statues, hoping I had them lined up perfectly, which is made harder because of the fixed camera angles. This example can be boiled down to me being stupid, and honestly that's a pretty good fucking argument, but like every block puzzle in this game, this isn't hard. But fuck me, is it absolutely annoying to die because of it. I am making it out like these block puzzles are the absolute worst thing in the world, and honestly that's because they are. But there aren't that many of them, and the cheap kill you ones only appear like twice, so they aren't that much of a big deal. I just like writing about things that annoy me, then recording those things and putting them into a video where I then upload them onto YouTube for people to watch. I just wish these block puzzles were gone and replaced with more actual puzzles. Just anything else except making me slowly push shit. Speaking of shit being slow, some of the puzzle animations physically aged me. There are several puzzle animations in this game that just take too long to complete. And the funny thing is, these puzzles never require more than a second of thought, some even less than that. The most annoying example of this I found is in the underground. You need to turn this crank to rotate the floor, which allows the player to cross. Okay, no big deal. Easy puzzle to solve, yeah, whatever. The problem is, it takes so damn long. Just watch how long it takes for it to do this. Again, not a massive deal breaker, but it just feels like there are so many things in this game which unintentionally slowed me down. When the game is trying to keep a constant feeling of atmosphere and tension, having to stop every few seconds to do something pointless that takes ages took away from that. After completing Resident Evil, I honestly don't understand why it's known for having puzzles. Most of the puzzles in the game aren't puzzles, not including some really good exceptions of course, and the others involve pushing boxes. I was expecting something more difficult or engaging, but I didn't get that. Most of the puzzles in Resident Evil are just barriers to player progression, and that's fine since that did not frustrate me and I believe that does have its benefits, but I was really expecting more. I just hope in the sequels the puzzles are expanded upon and make my brain do this. Something that is a bit more contentious than the whole argument of, the good parts and bad parts about old school survival horror is backtracking. Its inclusion simultaneously allows the player to become familiar with the game and have that sense of mastering it while also extending the game's playtime. The latter isn't really a problem in Resident Evil as the game is pretty short, but it can be annoying when you find some ammo but your inventory is full, so you have to run back to an item box to get rid of something just to run all the way back to grab the item and then run all the way back to store it. I made that sentence deliberately annoying because it sums up how backtracking can feel sometimes. I was kind of dreading having to run through the same areas over and over again because of what I just explained, but the game is tense enough and that feeling of conquering it really made me forget that I was exploring the same areas most of the time. The levels are small enough so backtracking isn't a long task, and there are several save rooms with item boxes throughout the game, so you don't have to run across the entire map just to store or get what you need. One problem I did have with backtracking is the opening door animations. The main argument for them is that they are a great use of creating tension and initially adds to the atmosphere, but they are damn slow because they hide load times. They honestly lost their charm for me. When I was backtracking through the mansion and had to sit through so many slow door opening animations, I just got sick of them. Again, I understand their reason for existing, but I still find them frustrating. Did you know there are monsters in this mansion? Well, if you didn't, I'm upset that you haven't been paying attention, but thanks for the watch time. The main enemies you'll encounter in Resident Evil are zombies, but you'll also face off against dead zombie dogs, these green assholes who like to jump on you and deal massive damage, spiders, and sharks? Umbrella just stuck this T-virus into anything, eh? Let's talk about this for a sec though. Humans, I get. Dogs, yeah, okay, sure. You are an evil corporation, you are so evil that you test on the goodest and most pure thing in the world because you want to wave your evil dick around. But like, spiders and sharks, now that's just getting dumb and pointless evil. You already created zombies and monsters. Why do you also need giant spiders and zombie sharks? Sharks already eat people. You don't need to change them to make them deadly, they already are.
I have one simple request. And that is to have sharks with frickin' laser beams attached to their heads.
You encounter some other creatures, but I don't want to reveal too much, and this fucking video is too long as it is. Zombies are the most common enemies, and though you will see them all of the time, they are still a threat, and they can really fuck up your day if you're grabbed by one. They are slow though, so you can outmaneuver them if you are clever enough. However, the rest of the enemies in the game are fast, and they can jump. This ramps up the danger, but can also be frustrating because they have more movement options than the player. And sometimes they will jump from outside the screen, which is just the funnest thing ever. It can also make shooting them a pain in the ass. I can't count how many times I tried shooting a hunter or a dog, but couldn't hit them because they decided to leap into the air and hit me. This just seems like a cheap way of making an enemy deadlier, and made me super aware on how limited I was both in movement and combat options. It didn't make these enemies scarier. I never encountered one of these guys and was like, oh, there's the scares right there. I was more annoyed because I knew I was about to waste bullets and take damage because they can fucking jump. I am down for increasing the difficulty, but giving a major unfair advantage to these enemies to create a semblance of difficulty isn't how I think it should be done. Sure, make them hit harder or move faster, but don't give them bullshit abilities the player has no way of avoiding. Luckily though, the faster enemies aren't everywhere, and they don't pull out the fuck your shit up card too often. One thing I did like about most of the enemies are their designs. They look pretty great for a game on the PS1. The zombies look like zombies. They are covered in blood, their clothes are ripped, and their skin is all pale. The dogs look gross, the hunters look beefy and brutal, and the other enemies later in the game have unique designs that really buttered my rolls. The only enemy I think looks dumb is the giant spider. It's just a giant spider. Nothing especially fucked up about that. Think of a spider, but then like make it bigger. I mean, I would be terrified of that, but I just thought it wasn't as creative as the other enemy designs. And at some point, you will have to actually shoot these enemies. The weapons you get in Resident Evil are a knife, pistol, shotgun, rocket launcher, a magnum, and a flamethrower at one point, but access to that is very limited. The combat in Resident Evil is as bare bones as bare bones. You point your gun and you shoot until the thing in front of you is dead, or if it's a zombie, shoot it until it's dead again. There honestly isn't that much more to it. Even though Resident Evil has combat, it usually is the last thing you want to do. The best idea is to avoid combat altogether and just run past most enemies so you don't waste resources. But that can be very risky because you got to get up all close and personal with these guys. When to engage in the combat is more of a strategic decision. The only time I thought it was necessary to kill an enemy was if it was placed in an area that I regularly visited, but it was too risky to constantly try and run past them. It is this constant balancing act that makes the simple combat in Resident Evil more engaging than it actually appears, because each bullet you shoot is an important decision you make and you need to truly think about it before pulling the trigger. Thankfully, I played the director's cut of the game, which has the auto aim. That makes the combat a lot more functional considering the use of fixed camera angles. This makes shooting enemies down a hall or in another screen an actual option, which is nice. But the original release had no auto lock, and I think I would rather watch Ben Shapiro videos and play this game without an auto lock feature.
That all of the water levels around the world rise by let's say 5 feet over the next 100 years, say 10 feet by the next 100 years, and it puts all the low-lying areas on the coast underwater, right? Which, let's say all of that happens. You think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move? It's not like wipes out everything. Human beings have more faith in human beings.
Just one small problem! Sell their houses to who, Ben? Fucking Aquaman!
Actually, on second thought, I think I'm just going to play the game. I guess the combat's simplicity could also be seen as a negative for some if you want something more rewarding or engaging, but I found it enjoyable because I saw combat more as a continuous puzzle that I needed to solve. So in that sense, I think it works. But one of my biggest disappointments of Resident Evil was the boss fights. Boss fights are weird. They are neither good nor bad, they just kind of exist in the game, and honestly, bosses tend to be easier to kill than most of the enemies in the game. You go up against several bosses and use the same tactic with every single one. Stand in one place and shoot them, occasionally move, rinse and repeat until they're dead. I know when I boil boss fights down to the most purest form, it can be applied to literally every boss fight ever, but Resident Evils were that simple that I wasn't engaged and just started thinking about them mechanically. And I think what made me feel this way is because they're not hard and they're not interesting. I know it's probably because of the limitations of the hardware and the fact this is the first entry in the whole series, but all the bosses just do the same thing. Move around a bit, hit you, move around a bit, hit you. The only boss I felt any kind of challenge with was the final form of the Tyrant, and that was only because he moved pretty fast. Even so, I killed him on my first try. The real threat from the boss fights doesn't come from the bosses themselves, but from using a large amount of bullets or health items. Bosses are a great way to waste all of those resources you've been saving up. Besides that, they just don't feel too threatening. Again, I don't think they're bad, they do the job they set out to do, and the Tyrant and Yawn are iconic enemies. I just thought, considering the danger throughout the rest of the game, the bosses would be like the epitome of that. And visually as well, the bosses are also hit and miss. The only boss design I truly liked were the Tyrant and the second phase of Yawn, because he's all rotten and injured from the first fight. They both look really cool and unique, but the rest are just boring in my opinion. A giant plant and a giant spider, and you already know how I feel about big spiders. Still, it was very early days, and some of these boss designs stood the test of time and became icons of the Resident Evil franchise, so it's not all bad. One area of the gameplay that I thought deserved its own section, and because I'm shit at writing these reviews and couldn't figure out how to put them in without making it jarring as fuck, are the differences between Jill and Chris's campaign. You see, when you start the game, you pick between either character. Do you want the burly muscle man who comes cool, or the woman who is literally better at everything in every way? They don't differ greatly in terms of the main story of what you'll actually be doing throughout the game, but they differ enough to make playing both worth the effort. So let me talk about these differences first. So the first one is Chris is considered as hard mode while Jill is considered as easy. And there are several factors that emphasize this, and the first is inventory size. Jill has 8 inventory slots while Chris has 6. A difference of 2 inventory slots may not seem like much, but this completely changed the game. Not only can Jill carry more puzzle pieces, but more importantly, she can carry more weapons, ammo, and health. When I was playing Jill's campaign, I was comfortable with the inventory space, because I had just enough to make sure the game was challenging, but not too restrictive. With Chris though, I would sit on the item box screen for minutes at a time, trying to figure out what I could take and what I could leave behind, while leaving room for potential items that I may find on my journey. What makes this a harder juggling act is because Jill is the
master of unlocking.
She can use lockpicks to unlock some doors or drawers that usually contain useful items. Chris is no master of unlocking, so he has to find these small keys to unlock the same things Jill can unlock, but just based on sheer talent. That means you have another inventory slot taken up by a key in Chris's campaign. If you don't find these keys, you can miss out on some resources that can make your experience a lot easier. And while we're on the topic of keys, Chris has a sword key in the campaign while Jill doesn't. That means Chris has to unlock more doors in the mansion with a specific key. Again, this makes Chris's campaign harder because there is another factor you need to think about while juggling his inventory. A reduced inventory also increases how often I was backtracking while playing as Chris, which may seem annoying, but it also increases the tension of the game because you are always in danger more often. I believe this is the main reason why Chris's campaign is harder, but he does have something that makes the game a bit easier compared to Jill. Chris can take more damage, which means the danger of constantly backtracking is somewhat balanced, which is nice because there are so many things stacked against Chris. Each character has unique companions that join them on their adventure, and these companions can also play into the difference in difficulty. Jill has the always handsome and beautiful Barry Burton by her side. He's a really cool dude who helps out in some dire situations, but also gives Jill a rocket launcher just out of fucking nowhere. He also leaves her resources from time to time. Chris has Rebecca, who isn't as helpful. She does help out in some puzzles, but in a different way, which I'll get into later. She can also heal Chris at one point, but that's about it really. Barry really helps Jill out throughout the entirety of her campaign, and it really reduces the game's challenge, while Chris has to fight for himself most of the time. I do like this as it makes Chris's campaign a much more tenser and lonelier experience. But one of the biggest differences is seen in the puzzles. Though the puzzles tend to be the same in terms of their solution, the execution is different. Or a puzzle will need to be actually solved when previously a companion would help out. That's vague, so let me explain. At one point in the game, Barry saves Jill's life when a roof is about to crush her because she took a shotgun off a wall. When Chris enters this room with a shotgun, he must replace it with a broken one, otherwise he will become a Chris version of some sort of wheat-based food item. I like this as it flips the expectation of the player when they go through both campaigns and emphasizes their differences. But examples such as this are few and far between, and instead, the changes tend to become more tedious and interesting. As I said before, Jill is an extremely capable and talented STARS member who has a basic education. Chris is an absolute idiot. The best example of this is the V-Jolt puzzle I mentioned earlier. You see, Jill knows basic math, which she uses to solve the V-Jolt puzzle all by herself. Chris sees numbers and thinks they're letters and can't even read the numbers until he finds a book that spells out the puzzle for him. There are several other puzzles that follow a similar format. Jill can do something or know something and Chris doesn't. The worst example of this is the difference that occurs when the player needs to get the shield crest from the music room. The puzzle involves the player needing to find musical notes to play a piano that will open a wall which reveals a crest. Both of the puzzles are the same up to this point, but here is where they diverge. For Jill, it's pretty easy. Since she is the best, she knows how to read music and can just play the song all by herself. Chris can't read music and must get Rebecca to help. So far, not bad. It's a difference, but not an annoying one. But here's where the changes become completely pointless. Rebecca must practice first because she hasn't played piano in a while, okay? I waited in the room listening to her play it, but she could never get it right. You want to know how you trigger her to play the song correctly? You have to walk back to the main hall, which honestly isn't far, and then walk back to the music room. After that, she knows how to play the song and the wall opens. This feels like a pretty pointless change just to make Chris's campaign more tedious and come across as difficult. I think that's the best way to describe some of these differences. Tedious. I appreciate the developers went to the efforts to make the campaigns different from one another, but they are usually done in a way that just makes the player do something pointless just to get the same result. If there were more puzzle pieces to collect or maybe a curveball thrown in, I think the differences would have served more of a purpose. Also, these puzzle differences and stuff, they just disappear after the player completes the guardhouse, which is about 2 hours into the game. I wish there was more of this mechanic and extended throughout the entirety of the game. It just makes playing Chris's campaign a mostly slower experience as opposed to a harder one. Now I've finally got through all of the gameplay shenanigans, let's talk about the environment. The environments in Resident Evil are widely regarded as some of the most iconic areas in any video game, and for good reason. As soon as I booted up the game and entered the Spencer Mansion, I immediately got the feeling that something wasn't right. Any mansion built by a rich white person is full of deep dark secrets, and this one made me feel the same. It is sprawling with numerous rooms, most of which are hidden behind locked doors, spiraling hallways, and 2 floors that connect and loop back to one another. Each area has a distinct feeling and artistic design that differentiates them, which also makes creating a mental map of the sprawling mansion a lot easier. The mansion holds up pretty well graphically thanks to pre-rendered backgrounds, but I did have some problems with them. Most of the connecting areas just look very plain. Now I know I just previously said the design of each location helped differentiate them all, and that is true, but how I differentiated them was purely based on the color. Here is an example of my thought process when exploring the mansion. Okay, I need to go through the main hall with the shitty carpet to get to the red hallway with the green door to find the cream area with the save room. Rooms themselves featured unique and interesting decor, but the areas between them were kinda disappointing. Also, the mansion isn't very spooky. The main reason why I felt this way was because the mansion was so well lit. I would hate to see the owner's electricity bill, to be honest. The bright lighting just takes away from the overall atmosphere of the game. Nothing is hidden and everything is visible. In terms of actual level design, the mansion is the most complicated area of Resident Evil and the place you will be spending most of your time. It requires the most keys to unlock doors and has the most puzzles to solve. At first, it is very daunting. Having to remember where certain locked doors are or puzzle pieces are really adds to the feeling that you are exploring this giant location. When I first started wandering around the mansion, it was quite overwhelming. It seemed like there were so many options and I could easily get lost. As I progressed through though, finding more keys to unlock more areas and becoming more accustomed to its layout through backtracking, I felt like I overcame one of the biggest hurdles in my gaming experience. Unfortunately, the other areas in Resident Evil don't really live up to the expectations set by the mansion. Unlike the sprawling hallways and dense areas of the mansion, the rest of the areas are basically small, straight lines or a box with very little to make them interesting or memorable. Usually it's just a hallway of rooms at the side, and most of them don't have numerous levels, and if they do, there is not much to actually see or do. They don't really require you to make a mental map because there are so few areas to explore, or they are bunched close together. I didn't feel lost or overwhelmed in the areas after the mansion, which took away one of the things that made playing Resident Evil a tense experience. I really wish the areas in the rest of the game were maybe condensed down into a single large location like the mansion, so the game would continue making me feel overwhelmed, or at least not make the other areas a straight line or a box. I'm keen to see whether the later games in this series fall into the same trap. I really hope not, because everything outside of the mansion was one of the things that disappointed me the most. But I can't underestimate how fucking cool the mansion is. And now we get onto the music. It is good when it goes into your ears, and I think the music is one of the most important aspects of a survival horror game in regards to creating its atmosphere. And I'm happy to report that the music in Resident Evil is one of my favourite things about it. Luckily, the version of the director's cut I played didn't have the new soundtrack, which contained classic songs such as this. I'm not well versed in discussing music. My best contribution is the instruments sound good when they're played that way, so I tend to analyze music based on how it makes me feel. What I like about the music in Resident Evil is that it's atmospheric, tense, but also catchy as hell. There is a good mixture of ambient sounds, guitar and piano that manage to fit well into the background and create a foreboding, oppressive mood, while also being distinctive enough so they are memorable. When I streamed the game on my Twitch channel, I found myself humming along to the songs. The obvious highlight is the safe room music, which perfectly encapsulates what I just said. It relaxes the player and tells them that for now, they're safe. While other tracks instill a feeling of danger. I previously mentioned the redone soundtrack for later releases and how bad it was, but it just proves how good the original music was and how important a good soundtrack is to a horror game. It really added to that overall experience, and when it was changed, it also changed the atmosphere of the game itself. Which is fair, because the new soundtrack sounds like hearing your parents have sex. You really don't want to hear it, but no matter what you do, you can't escape the awful sounds that will probably scar you for life. So after all that nonsense, basically, I'm really glad I gave Resident Evil a second chance because I fell in love with it. My use of a guide and dismissive opinions about the game was stopping me from enjoying one of the most classic survival horror games of all time. Even 20 years after its release, the game still holds up in most areas. Sure, visually it is aged and the voice acting and some of the puzzles are horrendous, but even at its worst, Resident Evil is a classic survival horror game. If you are like me and for whatever reason didn't like this game when you first tried it, I urge you to give it a second chance. The gameplay is still incredibly tense, the stress from managing your inventory and finite resources is fantastic, and its unforgiving nature makes it a truly terrifying experience. I cannot wait to dive into the other classic Resident Evil titles. I can officially say I am a fan of Resident Evil, though I still think Resident Evil 6 is a fantastic game and you can at me.
You don't suppose I think I can fly a plane, do you?